In November of 1976, on a 60-acre rolling hardwood-and-bluegrass pasture 3 miles east of Harrodsburg, Kentucky, a 41-year-old widow named Tabitha Trimble selected 6 Berkshire sows and 2 Berkshire boars from the last 11 breeding-age animals remaining of her father Walter Trimble's 1928 foundation herd, and committed every spring of the next 12 years to running a closed pasture-raised heritage hog operation on the same Mercer County section her father had purchased the original British Berkshire Foundation stock for, in February of 1928. The 11 remaining animals had been sitting on the Trimble home place since 1965, when Walter Trimble had grudgingly switched the working herd to commercial crossbred Yorkshire Landrace Hampshire pigs for the modern lean pork market. The 11 heritage Berkshires had been kept by Walter Trimble in a back-section paddock as breeding stock insurance, in case the crossbred lines ever needed an outcross, and they had still been there on the morning of August 14, 1973, when Walter Trimble had died of a stroke at 71 in the milking shed at the south end of the same paddock. The crossbred working herd had been sold off in the autumn of 1973 to settle the estate. The 11 heritage Berkshires had not been sold because no commercial hog buyer in Mercer County or in any of the 4 counties surrounding it had wanted them. Tabitha Trimble had inherited the home place in October of 1973, along with her late father's hog operation. She had been 38 years old. She had been widowed 4 months earlier in June of 1973, when her husband Cliff Trimble had been killed at 36 in a hay baler accident on the home place. She had been 38 and 4 months when the funeral processions had ended, and her mother, Adelaide Trimble, had moved into the Harrodsburg nursing home in November, and the home place had become hers to run alone with the help of a part-time hired man named Junior Boggs, and the 11 Berkshire sows and boars her father had refused to sell. She had been 41 in November of 1976, when she finally decided what she was going to do with them. The men at the Harrodsburg Cafe laughed for an hour and 20 minutes when they heard. They were still laughing 12 years later, in the autumn of 1988, when the 1986 commercial hog market crash had taken every confinement operator within 50 miles of Harrodsburg off the ground, and the only working hog operation in Mercer, Boyle, Garrard, and Washington counties was the Trimble 60-acre heritage Berkshire pasture east of town, and a Japanese-American specialty meat broker from Chicago named Hiroshi Tanaka was driving the 73 miles from the Bluegrass Field Airport in Lexington to the Trimble Gate every 4th Wednesday, with a folded contract for 20,000 pounds of pasture-raised Berkshire pork at $4.40 a pound. By the autumn of 1976, the agricultural orthodoxy of the American hog industry had reached the cleanest expression of its 100-year arc. The orthodoxy was simple. The modern commercial hog was a lean-bred crossbred, Yorkshire mother for prolificacy, crossed with landrace mother for length, then crossed with Hampshire or Duroc terminal sire for muscle and growth rate. The pig was raised in confinement on concrete slats, fed a corn and soybean ration formulated for maximum daily weight gain, finished to 240 pounds by 23 weeks of age, and shipped to a centralized packing plant for slaughter. The pig was bred for lean meat. The pig was bred to produce a uniform light pink pork chop that fit the new federal grading standards established in 1985. The pig was, in the professional consensus of every land-grant animal science department from Cornell to Iowa State to Texas A&M, the future of American pork production. The heritage breeds, Berkshire, Tamworth, Hampshire, the original colored Hampshire, not the modern crossbred line, Gloucester Old Spot, Large Black, Mulefoot, Red Wattle, had been the foundation of American pork production from the 1850s until the late 1950s. By 1976, they had been pushed to near extinction by the lean pork revolution. The American Berkshire Association Registry had recorded 11,000 active registrations in 1956 and 480 in 1976. The Tamworth Swine Association had recorded 6,000 active registrations in 1956 and 140 in 1976. The Mercer County Extension Service in 1976 maintained a complete records database of every active hog operation in the county. And on the morning of November 10, 1976, when the county extension agent, a man named Royce, who happened to be the brother-in-law of the largest commercial hog operator in the county and who had served in the same office for 19 years, had completed the November survey. The database contained 243 active hog operations, and exactly one of them was running heritage breeds. The one was the Trimble operation. Royce said it openly to anyone who would listen. He said it standing at the front of the Mercer County Pork Producers Association meeting. He said it sitting at the counter of the Harrodsburg Cafe at 7 in the morning. He said, "Heritage hogs in 1976 are sentimental animals. They grow slow. They fatten too much. They eat too much. They do not fit the lean pork market the National Pork Producers Council has been building since 1972. The Trimble widow has decided to honor her father. Nobody should mistake the gesture for a business decision. It was not a controversial position. It was the professional consensus of the University of Kentucky Animal Science Department, of the Mercer County Pork Producers Association, of every confinement hog finishing operation between Owensboro and Bowling Green. It was the consensus that heritage breeds in 1976 had no commercial future. It was the consensus that Tabitha Trimble was committing herself to an operation that would lose money every single year, until either she sold the home place or the heritage herd died out and forced her into commercial production. Tabitha Trimble had been raised on a different consensus. Her father, Walter Trimble, had been a young agricultural science graduate of the University of Kentucky in 1924. He had taken a one-year position as a junior animal science instructor at Eastern Kentucky State College in Richmond from 1925 to 1926. He had read, in the spring of 1926, a small monograph published by the British Berkshire Society in London describing the breed's historical role in the early American hog industry from 1823 forward, and its near collapse in the late 19th century crosses with imported Polish China and Chester white lines. Walter Trimble had decided in the autumn of 1926 that he was going to import original British Berkshires to reestablish a pure foundation herd on his family's Mercer County land. He had spent the winter of 1926 to 1927 corresponding with the British Berkshire Society and with a Berkshire breeder named Sir Wilfrid Pemberton at the Pemberton estate outside of Reading, Berkshire, England. He had purchased in March of 1927 4 registered Berkshire boars and 12 registered Berkshire sows from the Pemberton herd at a total cost of £3,480 sterling. The animals had been shipped from Liverpool in February of 1928, had crossed the Atlantic on the steamship Coronia, had been quarantined for 90 days at the port of Boston, and had arrived by railroad cattle car at the Harrodsburg depot on the morning of June 17, 1928. Walter Trimble had been the only American farmer to import British Berkshires that decade. The herd had been registered with the American Berkshire Association in October of 1928. Walter Trimble had unloaded the 4 boars and 12 sows from the railroad cattle car himself on the morning of June 17, 1928, with the help of his father, Owen Trimble, and 3 Mercer County neighbors who had ridden over to see the British animals. He had walked them through the depot stockyard to a hired flatbed wagon and had driven them home in 2 trips along the dirt section road to the Trimble home place. He had quarantined the herd for an additional 30 days in the back section paddock his father had built in 1922. He had registered every animal with the American Berkshire Association by October 14, 1928, and had received the registry certificates in the mail in December. He had kept the original Pemberton estate paperwork, the bill of sale signed by Sir Wilfrid Pemberton, the Royal Mail Customs declarations, the British Berkshire Society inspection certificate, and the Coronia steamship cargo manifest, in a fireproof tin box on the top shelf of his office closet from 1928 forward. Walter Trimble had run the herd as a closed, pure-bred operation from 1928 until 1965, when he had been pressured by the regional packing plant buyers to switch to commercial crossbreds. He had not sold the 11 remaining Berkshires in 1965. He had kept them. He had told his daughter Tabitha, the spring she turned 26 in 1961, that the day was coming when the lean pork market would crash, and the heritage breeds would be the only profitable hog operation left in Kentucky. Tabitha Trimble had been 26 years old in May of 1961 when her father had given her the lecture on the south porch of the farmhouse. She had been 38 when her father had died in August of 1973. She had been 41 in November of 1976 when she finally walked out to the back section paddock with a clipboard and a pencil and inventoried the 11 remaining heritage Berkshires, and decided that she would rebuild her father's foundation herd from the surviving animals and run a closed, purebred heritage operation on the Trimble 60 acres for the rest of her working life. She had told no one in Mercer County what she was planning. She had spent the months of August and September 1976 rebuilding the original 1928 farrowing shed by hand. She had replaced 38 rotted hardwood floor planks with fresh oak. She had patched the corrugated tin roof. She had oiled the leather harness on the original 1928 handcart Walter Trimble had used to move farrowing sows between the back section paddock and the farrowing shed. She had cleaned every section of split-rail cedar fencing along the boundary of the upper hardwood-and-bluegrass pasture. She had moved the 8 selected breeding stock animals from the back section paddock to the holding pen behind the farrowing shed on the morning of October 28, 1976. She had given each animal a single dose of the standard veterinary worming preparation her father had used on the herd in 1965. The only commercial product she had bought for the entire conversion. She had marked each animal with a hand-applied ear notch corresponding to her father's 1928 registry numbering system. She had walked the holding pen at 5 a.m. every morning for the 7 days before the first Sunday walkout to let the animals imprint to her voice and her presence. By the morning of the first Sunday of November 1976, the 8 animals followed her in a loose line at her own walking pace, from the holding pen to the upper pasture gate. By the morning of the first Sunday of November 1976, when Royce Maupin drove past the Trimble home place on his way home from the Harrodsburg First Presbyterian Church, and saw Tabitha Trimble walking the 8 selected breeding stock animals out to the main hardwood and bluegrass pasture on the rolling section above the farmhouse. The conversion was already underway. By the second Tuesday of November 1976, every farmer in Mercer County had heard about the Trimble widows' heritage decision. The Harrodsburg Cafe sat on Main Street, between the Mercer County Courthouse and the First Bank of Harrodsburg, and on Tuesday and Friday mornings between 5:30 and 7, the long formica counter filled with men in faded brown felt cowboy hats and faded blue ball caps, drinking coffee from chipped enamel mugs and arguing about the spot price of feeder pigs at the Lexington stockyards, and the prospects for the November corn harvest, and the question of whether the new federal pork promotion order would help or hurt the small Kentucky operator. The Trimble widows' heritage decision had become the dominant topic of conversation by the third week of November. Royce Maupin had told the story at the counter 4 mornings in a row. He had told it again at the November Pork Producers Association meeting. He had told it once more at the First Presbyterian Church coffee hour on the second Sunday of November. By the end of November, he had told it in some form to every farmer within 50 miles of Harrodsburg. The story changed slightly with each telling. By the time it reached Royce Maupin's brother-in-law, Hampton Maupin, who ran the 720 sow confinement operation south of town, the story was that Tabitha Trimble had decided to throw away the family farm on a pure-bred heritage herd, and was claiming, on the authority of her dead father's 1961 advice, that the lean pork market would crash sometime in the next decade. The mockery in Harrodsburg was not cruel. It was a kind of small-town disbelief that wore the clothing of concern. At the feed mill on Wednesday afternoon, Tabitha heard a man named Coy Whitehouse, who had bought Berkshire feeder pigs off her father in the 1950s and had switched to commercial crossbreds in 1962, tell another customer that the Trimble widow had let her grief get the better of her judgment. At the First Bank of Harrodsburg on the Saturday before Thanksgiving, the bank manager pulled Tabitha aside after she had finished a routine deposit and asked her, in a low and respectful voice, whether she had thought through what the cost differential on heritage feed conversion was going to do to her household budget over the next 5 years. At the First Presbyterian Church potluck on the third Sunday of November, the minister's wife pulled Tabitha aside in the basement fellowship hall and asked her, in a careful voice, whether the heritage decision was something Cliff would have approved of. Tabitha had looked at the minister's wife across the corner of a folding card table that held a covered casserole and a glass pan of bourbon pecan pie, and had said, "Cliff would have asked me what my father thought." The minister's wife had said nothing, Tabitha had carried her green bean casserole back to the kitchen and washed her own dish. Royce Maupin had been Cliff Trimble's neighbor for 16 years. He had farmed the section south of the Trimble home place since 1961. By the autumn of 1976, he was 56 years old. He was stocky and barrel-chested. His face had gone ruddy from decades of supervising open-air confinement operations. His brown stubble was going gray across his cheeks and jaw. His deep-set blue-gray eyes were squinted from years of looking across the slatted-floor hog barns and the loading chute alleys of the family confinement operation. He wore a faded brown felt cowboy hat with a sweat-stained band, a faded denim jacket over a red and white plaid pearl-snap shirt, dark blue Wrangler jeans softened by years of washes, and scuffed brown lace-up work boots. His mouth had the paternalistic, worried set of a man who had spent his whole life believing he was responsible for other people's decisions. He had wanted the Trimble 60 acres before Cliff died. He had wanted it more after. He had not, in the 3.5 years between Cliff's death and the heritage decision, openly raised the subject with Tabitha. He had instead approached it sideways. He had stopped by on Sunday afternoons. He had brought casseroles his wife Junella made. He had asked, in the tone of a neighbor who was simply being practical, whether Tabitha had thought about leasing the lower 30-acre pasture to the Maupin operation for a couple of seasons. He had offered to bush hog her ditches. He had offered to send his son over to fix windmills. He had told her more than once that any decision she wanted to make about the operation would have his full support. Tabitha had thanked him. She had not leased the lower 30. She had not asked his son to fix the windmills. She had bush-hogged her own ditches with the 1968 Massey Ferguson 135 her father had bought in 1969. The heritage decision changed the conversation. Royce heard about it from his hired man, Junior Boggs, who happened to also be Tabitha's part-time hired man, and who had been at the Trimble gate on the first Sunday of November to help her walk the breeding stock to the pasture. Junior had told Royce at the gas station on the Monday morning. Royce had not believed him. Royce had driven past the Trimble home place himself on the Tuesday afternoon and had counted, by the rough estimate of a man who would run confinement hogs for 28 years, 8 unmistakably pure-bred black and white Berkshires foraging on the upper rolling pasture above the Trimble farmhouse. Royce had driven home to his wife Junella at 6 in the evening and had sat at the kitchen table with his hat off and his elbows on the oilcloth and had said, "Junella, my brother-in-law's wife's neighbor, has lost her mind." Junella Maupin had set down a coffee pot and had said, "Royce, you do not call her that ever again. She is Cliff's widow, and she is your goddaughter's mother, and she is 41 years old, and she has buried a husband and a father, and her mother is in the Harrodsburg nursing home, and she has been running the home place alone for 3.5 years. You will go over there tomorrow, and you will ask her what she has done, and you will listen to the answer." Royce Maupin had gone over the next morning. Tabitha was standing at the south gate of the upper pasture with a leather tally book in her left hand and a pencil in her right, when she heard Royce Maupin's truck pull up to the lane. She did not turn around. She finished the entry she was writing. She closed the tally book. She walked across the bluegrass to the gate. "Royce, Tabitha, you want coffee?" "No." She had expected the question. She had expected the visit, although not on this particular Wednesday. She crossed her arms. She waited. "Junior told me yesterday," Royce said. "I came over today. I drove past the upper pasture yesterday, and I counted 8 Berkshires. I came home, and I asked Junella to set me straight. Junella told me to come ask you." "Tabitha, what in God's name have you done?" "I have selected 8 breeding stock animals from my father's 1928 heritage herd, and I have committed the home place to a closed, pure-bred heritage Berkshire pasture operation for the next 12 years minimum. I am breeding 2 boars to 6 sows on rotational pasture. I am farrowing in the original 1928 farrowing shed. I am finishing on acorn and pasture forage with a small ration of corn and mixed grain supplementation. I am direct marketing the finished hogs to specialty butchers as soon as the herd reaches harvest scale, which, by my projection, is the spring of 1979. I am running a closed herd. I am not buying breeding stock from anyone else. I am not crossing to commercial lines. I am farming the home place on heritage Berkshires for the rest of my working life. Tabitha, Royce, you have 8 Berkshires on a working hog operation. The Berkshire breed has been pushed to 480 registry registrations in the entire United States by the lean pork revolution. The commercial market wants light pink lean meat. The Berkshire produces dark marbled meat with too much intramuscular fat for the federal grading standards established last year. Your finished hog at 240 pounds is going to come in at 30% fat against a commercial standard of 20. The packing plant in Owensboro is going to refuse to buy your hogs at the spot price. You are going to have to find specialty buyers who will pay a premium for marbled pork. There is no specialty market for marbled pork in 1976, Tabitha. There has not been a specialty market for marbled American pork in 25 years. You are committing yourself to a hog operation that has no buyer. By the spring of 1979, you are going to have 80 finished Berkshires sitting in your pasture with no commercial outlet. You're going to sell them at salvage prices. You're going to lose $40,000 in 3 years on a sentimental tribute to your dead father. Tabitha, my father said in 1961 that the day would come when the lean pork market would crash and the heritage breeds would be the only profitable hog operation left in Kentucky. The day is closer than you think. The Corn Belt confinement operators are over-leveraged. The commodity hog cycle is on a 4-year peak and crash pattern. The next cycle peak is going to come in 1984, and the next crash is going to come in 1986. By 1986, your 720 sow operation is going to be looking at hog prices below feed cost, and you're going to be selling sows at $30 a piece. My closed herd is going to be running at 60% feed cost because the pigs are foraging acorns in pasture instead of buying commodity grain. My direct-to-buyer specialty market is going to be paying 4 times the commodity spot price because the specialty restaurants want marbled pork, and the Kurabuta export market to Japan is going to open in the late 1980s, and the Berkshire is the breed that fits the Japanese specialty requirement. I am not asking you to understand this. I am telling you what I am doing so you do not have to ask me again. Royce Maupin took his hat off, then put it back on, then took it off again. He looked across the bluegrass at the 8 Berkshires foraging on the upper pasture. He looked back at Tabitha. He said, "Tabitha, I cannot stop you. I cannot help you. I am going home. I will watch what happens." He drove home. The 1979 first commercial harvest came in mid-spring. Tabitha had spent the winter of 1978 to 1979 finishing 84 pasture-raised Berkshires on a feeding program her father had documented in the 1930s. 40% corn and mixed grain supplementation, 60% rotational acorn and bluegrass forage. She had not bought a single pound of commercial finisher feed. The pigs had averaged a daily weight gain of 1 4/10 pounds against a commercial confinement standard of 1 8/10. But the feed cost per pound of gain had been 43% below the commercial rate. The finished hogs had ranged in dressed weight from 184 to 212 pounds. Tabitha had transported the 84 animals to a small custom slaughterhouse in Bardstown, the same custom slaughterhouse her father had used in the 1950s. Over 5 separate Saturday morning drives in March and April of 1979. Tabitha sold 84 finished Berkshires to a single specialty butcher in Louisville at a price per pound of $2.10, well above the commodity spot price of 58 cents, but below what she had projected. The butcher had been recommended to her by a University of Kentucky meat science professor she had cold called in the autumn of 1978. His name was Helmut Schuler. He was a 64-year-old German immigrant butcher who had emigrated to Louisville in 1949 after 8 years working in his uncle's small charcuterie in Stuttgart. He had been running his downtown Louisville shop since 1953. He had bought finished Berkshire hogs off small Kentucky operators through the late 1950s and had been forced to switch to commercial crossbreds in the mid-1960s when his suppliers had stopped breeding heritage stock. He had said to Tabitha on the telephone in November of 1978 in a thick accent that had not softened in 30 years of American residency, "Mrs. Trimble, if you can deliver true British Berkshire to my shop dressed and clean, I will buy every pound you can produce for the rest of my working life. I had stopped looking for them. I am pleased to find that one operator did not stop keeping them. Helmut Schuler had bought every Berkshire from the Trimble operation between 1979 and his retirement in 1991, at premium prices that allowed Tabitha to cover her costs and net a working profit through every year of the operation's quiet decade. The butcher had run a high-end downtown Louisville shop catering to a small community of European immigrant restaurateurs who remembered marbled pork from before the lean pork revolution. The butcher had bought every Berkshire Tabitha could deliver in 1979, 1980, 1981, and every year through 1985. The total revenue ranged between $32,000 and $48,000 a year. The total net, after feed and labor and the property tax allocation, ranged between $14,000 and $21,000. The Maupin 720 sow confinement operation at the same time was netting between $110,000 and $160,000 a year. The Maupin operation was netting on a per-sow basis about $200. The Trimble operation was netting on a per-sow basis between $2,300 and $3,500. The per-sow profitability gap was the gap Royce Maupin did not, in the years between 1979 and 1985, take seriously. He attributed it to lower input costs on a smaller scale. He decided to wait until the next commodity cycle crash to revisit the conversation. He did not have long to wait. If you have ever raised the breed your father imported across the Atlantic, if you have ever heard your father's voice in a 1961 porch lecture and decided to listen to him over every Pork Producers Association president and every land-grant animal science department in your state, this story is for you. Stay with us. There is one of these stories in every county in America, and the one we are telling you today comes from Mercer County, Kentucky, in the autumn of 1988, 12 years after Tabitha Trimble walked her father's 8 surviving Berkshires out to the upper pasture. The years between 1976 and 1985 were the deep work years. Tabitha Trimble farrowed her father's foundation sows every spring and every autumn on the rotational pasture system she had built. She added a third boar from a small Berkshire breeder in Ohio in 1979 to bring in new bloodlines. She added a fourth boar from a registered Berkshire breeder in Saskatchewan in 1982. She kept the closed herd records in pencil in a leather breeding register she had bought at the Harrodsburg drugstore in November of 1976 for $1.40. She added her own notes alongside her father's 1928 to 1965 entries. She sold finished hogs to the Louisville butcher every spring and every autumn. She refreshed the heritage genetics every 5th year by sending tissue samples to the American Berkshire Association laboratory in Iowa to verify the line was holding pure. By the end of 1981, the Trimble operation had become, in the unofficial assessment of every Mercer County farmer who drove past on Highway 127, the most profitable per-acre hog operation in central Kentucky. The Trimble Berkshire stock consistently produced finished hogs at 23 weeks of age, 240 pounds, with intramuscular fat at 12% against the commercial 4. The hogs foraged acorns and pasture for 60% of their feed conversion and required only 40% commodity grain supplementation. The commodity confinement operators on the same county were buying every pound of feed at retail and finishing on slatted floor barns that consumed propane heat in the winter. The men at the Harrodsburg Cafe stopped making jokes about the heritage operation in 1982. They simply stopped making them in front of Tabitha Trimble. The mockery moved sideways. By 1983, it had become a mockery that focused on the unusualness of the operation rather than on its performance. The men at the counter said that Tabitha had gotten lucky on input costs. They said that one good cycle proved nothing. They said that the real test would come when the heritage breed had to compete in the commodity market without a specialty butcher carrying the price. In the winter of 1983, Tabitha received a letter from a researcher at the University of Kentucky in Lexington named Dr. Glenda Tichenor. Dr. Tichenor was an associate professor of animal science. Her research program focused on heritage breed swine genetic conservation. She had read about the Trimble operation from a 1982 article in the Kentucky Farmer magazine that had described the heritage planting without naming Tabitha. Dr. Tichenor had written Tabitha a letter on January 18, 1983, on university letterhead, asking whether Tabitha would consent to a multi-year research collaboration in which Dr. Tichenor would document the closed herd breeding history and the production economics of pasture-raised heritage Berkshire on a working Kentucky operation. Dr. Titchener promised in writing that no individual operator would be named in any peer-reviewed publication without the operator's express written permission. Tabitha answered 3 weeks later. She said yes. She said, "Don't use my name." Dr. Glenda Titchener arrived at the Trimble Gate on the morning of April 14, 1983, in a 1980 silver Plymouth Volare, with 2 graduate student assistants in the back seat. She introduced herself to Tabitha at the gate. She asked to walk the upper pasture on foot before they did anything else. Tabitha walked her out. The April light was long across the rolling bluegrass. Dr. Titchener stopped at the second sow. She knelt. She measured the sow's body condition score with a hand caliper. She turned to Tabitha and she said, "Mrs. Trimble, this sow is in better breeding condition than any commercial sow I have measured in 19 years of field work. Her body fat is properly distributed. Her udder is healthy. Her hoof condition is exceptional. The herd you are running is in better health than any confinement herd in the southeastern United States by any clinical measure I can apply. I am here for 1 day. May I have 4? Tabitha gave her 4. Dr. Titchener walked the upper pasture, sampled the breeding register, photographed her father's 1928 to 1965 entries, recorded the breeding history all the way back to the 1928 Pemberton importation, and confirmed by DNA testing in 1986 that the Trimble Berkshire herd carried the original 1928 British genetic markers without any commercial crossbred introgression. She walked the upper pasture over 4 consecutive 12-hour days. She body condition scored every breeding age sow in the herd at 68 sample points. She measured wither height and shoulder caliper at 32 animals. She collected ear notch tissue from every breeding age boar and from 20% of the sow herd for DNA analysis at the Kentucky State Pathology Laboratory in Lexington. She mapped the rotational pasture grazing pattern with a hand-drawn topographic overlay. She returned to the kitchen on the 4th evening and sat across the Formica table from Tabitha. She said, "Mrs. Trimble, the genetic purity of your herd is the highest I have ever measured in any closed population Berkshire stand in the United States. Your DNA markers correspond to the pre-1900 British line at 98.3% purity. Your animal health markers are clinically exceptional. Your rotational pasture grazing pattern is achieving forage conversion ratios that the confinement industry will not match in my lifetime. I am going to publish what I have measured here. I will not name you. I will refer to your operation as a private cooperator." She published between 1984 and 1986 3 papers in the Journal of Animal Science and Genetics that referenced the Trimble operation only as Cooperator H. The papers were the most cited articles in their journals in the years they appeared. None of the Mercer County hog operators found Cooperator H. Then the spring of 1986 arrived. The commodity hog market entered the spring of 1986 on the front edge of a 4-year cycle crash. The 1984 peak had pushed feeder pig prices to $78 a head. The cycle had built excess capacity in confinement finishing operations across the Midwest. The 1985 grain price spike, driven by Soviet wheat purchases and the federal payment-in-kind program, had pushed corn from $2.40 a bushel in May 1984 to $3.20 in May 1985. Confinement hog operators who bought every pound of feed at retail had absorbed a 40% jump in input costs between 1984 and 1985, while their finished hog spot prices had held flat. By March of 1986, the commodity hog price had begun to slide. By May, the spot price at the Owensboro packing plant had fallen to $32 per hundredweight against a confinement break-even of $48. By July, the spot price was $29. The Owensboro packing plant had begun, on the morning of June 3, 1986, to refuse new finished hog deliveries from operations carrying inventory above its 48-hour processing capacity. By June 12th, the plant had begun pricing accepted deliveries at the spot price minus $3 per hundredweight for handling. By July 1st, the plant had announced a permanent reduction in slaughter shifts from 3 per day to 2. The Mercer County confinement operators were trapped. Every operator who held finished hogs through July would be paying property tax on inventory that was losing value by the day. Every operator who slaughtered at salvage prices would be locking in losses against operating notes that had been written at break-even pricing. The Owensboro plant refused to discuss contract revisions. The Federal Crop Insurance Commission refused to acknowledge confinement hog inventory as covered loss under the existing federal disaster program. The Maupin operation, by the end of July, was selling sows at the rendering price of $14 per hundredweight to free up barn space for finishing hogs that were still under contract from earlier deliveries. The Maupin 720 sow operation, by the morning of August 1st, 1986, was losing approximately $22 on every finished hog leaving the loading chute. The Maupin operation had taken out a $400,000 operating note from the First Bank of Harrodsburg in February of 1986 against the expected June harvest and the autumn hog sales. The note was now under-collateralized by an estimated $120,000 because the bank had revalued the confinement hog inventory at the new spot price in July. Royce Maupin had been told by the bank manager on August 7, 1986, that the operating note would be called by January 15, 1987, if the spot price did not recover, or if no additional collateral could be brought to the table. The Trimble Heritage operation on the same morning of August 1, 1986, was not selling into the commodity market. The Louisville butcher was paying $2.40 a pound for the Berkshire finished hogs against the regional commercial bone in-dressed price of 42 cents a pound. The Trimble operation on per-hog terms was generating about $200 net per finished hog against a commercial loss of negative 22. The Trimble operation had no operating note at the bank. The Trimble operation had no debt. The Trimble operation was not affected by the 1986 commodity crash at all. By the end of the third week of August 1986, every farmer in Mercer County had heard. The story did not change in the telling. The commodity operators were under. The heritage operation was standing. By the end of October, the Owensboro packing plant buyer had stopped accepting new finished hog deliveries from Mercer County operators because the plant could not absorb additional supply at the current spot price. By the end of November, 3 of the 6 confinement operations in Mercer County had filed for bankruptcy protection. By the end of January 1987, 5 of the 6 were either in active foreclosure or in voluntary liquidation. The Maupin operation was the last one still functioning, and only because Royce had agreed to a 5-year debt restructure with the First Bank of Harrodsburg on January 20th, 1987, that effectively reduced his confinement hog inventory by 60% and converted half the slatted floor barns to row crop storage. The Maupin operation, after the restructure, was a quarter the size it had been in 1985. Hampton Maupin, Royce's brother-in-law, who had run the largest confinement operation in the county, had not been able to restructure and had lost the operation entirely by March of 1987. Hampton had moved to Lexington and had taken a salaried position with a feed supplement company. Royce Maupin had spent the spring and summer of 1987 on a half-functioning operation that was barely covering its property taxes. He had not driven past the Trimble home place since the previous October. He had not been able to look at the rolling hardwood pasture and the foraging Berkshires without feeling something he did not have the language to describe. He had not been ready to drive over until the autumn of 1988, after the heritage operation had been visited by Hiroshi Tanaka. Hiroshi Tanaka was a 52-year-old Japanese-American specialty meat broker who had been born in San Francisco in 1936, interned with his family at Topaz, Utah, from 1942 to 1945, attended the University of California at Berkeley from 1954 to 1958, and worked in the high-end Japanese import meat trade in Chicago since 1962. He had been hired in the autumn of 1986 by a Tokyo-based specialty pork import company that was looking to source authentic American heritage Berkshire, the Kurabuta breed of Japanese tradition, for the rapidly growing post-bubble economy high-end Tokyo restaurant trade. Hiroshi Tanaka had spent 14 months scouring the United States for working Berkshire operations of sufficient herd size and verified genetic purity to support a sustained export contract. He had visited 11 Berkshire breeders between November of 1986 and December of 1987. He had driven 32,000 miles in rental cars across 19 states. He had stayed in 74 small-town motels. He had eaten in 140 diners. He had reviewed 43 breeding registries. He had photographed 2,070 individual animals. He had collected ear-notch tissue samples from 190 boars for DNA verification at a Tokyo laboratory. He had carried with him on every visit a folded sheet of paper showing the standard 1880s British Berkshire phenotype: the solid black coat with white markings on the 4 feet, the face, the snout, the ear tips, and the tip of the tail. He had compared every herd against the standard. He had rejected 10 of the 11 breeders on grounds of either genetic purity verification gaps or insufficient herd size. The 11th was the Trimble operation. He had visited the Trimble gate for the first time on the morning of January 8th, 1988, in a rented charcoal-gray Lincoln Town car driven from the Bluegrass Field Airport in Lexington. He had carried a folded contract in a brown leather attaché case. He had introduced himself to Tabitha at the gate. He had asked to walk the upper pasture before they did anything else. Tabitha had walked him out. The January light was low and golden across the leaf-littered pasture. Hiroshi Tanaka had stopped at the foraging boar. He had knelt. He had inspected the boar's coat markings, the ear shape, the snout length, and the hoof color. He had turned to Tabitha, and he had said, "Mrs. Trimble, this animal carries the authentic phenotype of the pre-1900 British Berkshire line. I have visited 11 operations in this country looking for this exact animal. I would like to discuss a 5-year export contract with your operation. May I have a day?" Tabitha had given him a day. They had sat at the Trimble kitchen table at 4 in the afternoon. Hiroshi Tanaka had opened the brown leather attaché case. He had laid the folded contract on the formica table. The contract committed Tabitha to deliver 20,000 pounds of pasture-raised Berkshire pork per quarter, dressed and frozen to specifications at a base price of $4.40 a pound on a 5-year exclusive export contract to the Tokyo importer. The total annual revenue at full delivery would be $352,000. The annual net, after feed and labor and the property tax allocation, would be approximately $190,000. Tabitha read the contract 3 times. She wrote 2 questions in pencil in the margin. She asked Hiroshi Tanaka the 2 questions. He answered both clearly. She signed the contract at 20 minutes after 5. Hiroshi Tanaka drove back to Lexington and flew home to Chicago that night. The first export shipment left the Trimble operation in mid-April of 1988. The shipment was a 24,000-pound load of dressed and frozen Berkshire pork in 60-pound waxed cardboard cases, loaded onto a refrigerated trailer at the Harrodsburg stockyards on the morning of April 14, 1988, and driven by a contracted long-haul refrigerated carrier from Harrodsburg to a USDA-inspected cold storage warehouse on the southwest side of Chicago. The shipment was bonded for export. The paperwork was processed through the Chicago Customs Office on April 16th. The first container of Trimble Berkshire pork left the port of Chicago bound for the port of Yokohama on the morning of April 24, 1988. The cash payment for the first quarter delivery, $88,000 net to Tabitha after carrier and handling fees, arrived in the Trimble First Bank of Harrodsburg account by wire transfer on May 7th. Tabitha had cashed out $15,000 of it the same afternoon. She had bought a 1986 Ford F250 pickup truck at the Harrodsburg dealer to replace the 1968 Chevrolet C2 her father had bought in 1969. She had paid in full in cash. The dealer had handed her the keys with a small handshake at 3:45 p.m. on the 7th of May. Royce Maupin drove over to the Trimble gate on a cold Saturday afternoon in early November 1988, 10 months after Hiroshi Tanaka's first visit. The autumn 1988 export harvest had been completed 2 weeks earlier. The Trimble operation had delivered, in its first 3 quarters of contract performance, just under 60,000 pounds of pasture-raised Berkshire pork to the Chicago freight dock at Tanaka's import warehouse. The total revenue had been just over $260,000. The net had been approximately $140,000. Tabitha Trimble had hired 2 additional full-time hands in March of 1988 Junior Boggs's brother Levon Boggs, and a young University of Kentucky animal science graduate named Winona Doss to handle the expanded operation. She had added 45 acres of additional rotational pasture by leasing the White House section on Coy Whitehouse's Heritage Farm on the north fence line. She had built a second farrowing shed at the lower end of the original pasture. She had not yet repaired the Massey Ferguson 135. She was farming the home place on Berkshires and a leased pasture and 3 hired hands and a 5-year export contract. Royce Maupin stood at the open gate of the upper pasture. He looked at the rolling bluegrass and the foraging Berkshires. He looked back at Tabitha, who had walked out from the original farrowing shed with the leather breeding register in her arm. He took off his faded brown felt cowboy hat. He set it against his chest. Tabitha, Royce, I have been thinking about Cliff. I have been thinking about your father Walter. I have been thinking about what I should have said in the autumn of 1976 when you walked the first 8 Berkshires out to the upper pasture. I am here to tell you that I know it now. I should have known it by 1983 when the Maupin operation hit its peak and your operation was still growing. I did not know it because I am the kind of man I am. I am not asking forgiveness. I am asking if I can come stand at this gate one Saturday afternoon a season and learn what I should have learned in 1976. Tabitha unlatched the gate. She held it open. She said, Royce, you are forgiven. You were forgiven on the night Junella sent you over here in November of 1976. You did not need to come today. I did need to come today, Tabitha. Then come walk the pasture. He came in. He walked the pasture with her for an hour. He looked at the sows. He looked at the boars. He looked at the foraging weaner pigs. He took the leather breeding register from her hands. He read 3 pages of Walter Trimble's 1928 to 1930 entries. He gave the register back. He drove home at dusk. The next Saturday, he came back. The Saturday after that, he came back. By the end of November 1988, he had come back 4 Saturdays in a row. He did not pay her for the visits. She did not ask him to. The Saturday visits became, in the Maupin and Trimble families, a thing that was understood and not discussed. They continued until Royce Maupin's death in 2004. The wooden upper pasture gatepost was named for him in his obituary in the Mercer County News. The Mercer County News ran a feature in its November 15, 1988 edition under the headline, The Heritage Herd That Saved the County. The article was 9 column inches on the front page and continued for 16 more inside. Junior Boggs was quoted. He said, I worked beside Tabitha for 15 years. I knew the heritage herd was right by 1981. I should have spoken up then. I am sorry I waited until the 1986 crash hit. Coy Whitehouse was quoted. He had bought feeder pigs off Walter Trimble in the 1950s. He said, I knew Walter Trimble. I bought my first Berkshires off him in 1948. I switched to commercial crossbreds in 1962 like everybody else, and I have regretted it every harvest since. I will say this once, the daughter is what the father was, and what the father was the smartest hog farmer this county has produced in 3 generations. I am sorry I did not say so in 1976. Royce Maupin was quoted. He said, I owe my brother's friend's widow my county. I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve to call her my sister. Dr. Glenda Tishanor at the University of Kentucky was quoted, She said, "We have known about the Trimble operation since the spring of 1983. Mrs. Trimble asked us to keep her name out of the literature. We did. We are no longer going to. The Trimble operation is the foundation of heritage Berkshire genetic conservation in the United States. It is, as far as we have been able to measure, the largest documented closed-herd, pure-bred heritage hog operation in continuous family stewardship east of the Mississippi River. It has been quietly run for 12 years by a single Kentucky widow on 8 breeding stock animals. Her father imported from a British estate in 1928. The article noted in its final paragraph that the Trimble operation had been the only viable hog operation in Mercer County during the 1986 commodity hog market crash, that the operation had signed a 5-year export contract in January of 1988 with a Tokyo-based specialty pork import company at a base price of $4.40 per pound, and that the American Berkshire Association had requested, through Dr. Tichenor, that the Trimble operation serve as the foundation source for a national heritage breed conservation registry. The article did not note, because Tabitha Trimble had not told the reporter, that the leather breeding register on file at the Trimble operation had been started by Walter Trimble in October of 1928, the week after the original British Berkshires had arrived by railroad cattle car at the Harrodsburg depot, that the register contained handwritten entries in Walter Trimble's pencil cursive for 58 consecutive years between 1928 and his death in 1973, and that the 8 Foundation Berkshires Tabitha had selected from the back section paddock on the first Sunday of November 1976 had been the last surviving direct descendants of Sir Wilfred Pemberton's 1927 Berkshire herd on either side of the Atlantic Ocean. 8 breeding stock animals, 60 acres of rolling Mercer County bluegrass and hardwood, a heritage-hog-farmer's daughter. The breed nobody wanted in the hands of the woman nobody understood, until they saw what a pasture-raised, closed-herd Berkshire operation could do in the worst commodity hog crash central Kentucky could remember. She farmed the home place for 19 more years. She ran the Kurabuta export contract from 1988 through 2007, renewing the original 5-year contract 3 times. By the end of her career, the Trimble Berkshire herd had supplied foundation genetics to 74 working heritage hog operations across 21 states. The American Berkshire Association Registry, which had recorded 480 active registrations in 1976, recorded 11,400 in 2007. The recovery is directly traceable, in the association's own historical records, to the Trimble Foundation herd. The original 1928 Pemberton importation paperwork her father had filed at the American Berkshire Association office in Ames, Iowa, is now on display in the association's small heritage breed museum. The fireproof tin box on the top shelf of Walter Trimble's office closet, the box that held the 1928 Pemberton Estate Bill of Sale, the Royal Mail Customs Declarations, the British Berkshire Society Inspection Certificate, and the Coronia Steamship Cargo Manifest, was donated by Tabitha to the American Berkshire Association Heritage Breed Museum in Ames in 2008, along with the original 1928 to 1965 leather breeding register. The 4 documents are displayed today in a glass-fronted oak cabinet beside a small-framed black-and-white photograph of Walter Trimble at age 28, standing beside the lead boar of the original 1928 herd on the morning of June 17, 1928, 2 hours after he had unloaded the animals at the Harrodsburg depot. The photograph had been taken by Walter Trimble's father, Owen Trimble, with a Brownie camera that the family had owned since 1916. The cabinet card beneath the photograph reads, in hand-lettered cursive, Walter Trimble, June 1928, the first American to import original British Berkshires that decade. Tabitha Trimble did not explain why she chose the breed, not because the why was hidden. The why had been sitting in a leather breeding register on a Mercer County farmhouse kitchen shelf since 1928, waiting for a daughter who would walk out to the back section paddock on the first Sunday of November 1976 with a clipboard and a pencil and decide that her father had been right in 1961. If you have ever raised a breed your father imported across the ocean, leave a comment below telling us what it was. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe and ring the bell. There is one of these stories in every county in America. We are working through them, one harvest at a time.